Here are two economies. Both export enormous quantities of manufactured goods. Both have factories running at capacity. Both show up in the same paragraph of the same reports. One of them is getting more powerful every year. The other is running very hard to stay where it is. Nothing in the export data distinguishes them. Nothing in the growth data distinguishes them. The difference is real, it is large, and it is invisible to every number that gets reported. Over 7 episodes this season, we kept walking into that same problem from different directions. And by the end, the same 4 questions were doing all the work, every time, in every case. This is the last file of the season. Today, the map. This is the Rise Index. This season has been one question asked 8 ways: how power actually moves. 7 answers in, it is time to put them on the same page. And the first thing to do is get rid of the format everyone else uses, which is the ranking. Rankings of national power fail for a specific reason. They collapse several independent things into one number, and the things they collapse move separately. A country can be enormously powerful on one axis and helpless on another, at the same time, permanently. Averaging those into a single position on a league table destroys exactly the information you needed. There is a second problem with rankings, and it is worse. A ranking is a claim about the future dressed as a description of the present. Number 3 implies. Number 3 is going somewhere, and nothing in the underlying data says that. The 4 questions do not produce a rank. They produce a position and a set of things to watch, which is less satisfying and considerably more useful. So instead, 4 questions. They came out of the 7 files rather than being imposed on them. And by the end of this episode, you will be able to run them yourself on a country we have never covered. The 4th one is the one almost nobody asks, and it is the one that explains the strangest case of the season. Question 1. Does this country hold something the world cannot easily replace? Hold that phrasing carefully, because the obvious reading of it is wrong, and the wrong reading is what most commentary about resources and supply chains runs on. File 1 was about the sharpest example available. The most advanced semiconductors on Earth are manufactured at a scale and quality that is concentrated to an extraordinary degree in one place, and the equipment that makes them is concentrated further still. The important property is not the market share, it is the replacement time. A choke point is only a choke point if replacing it takes years and enormous capital rather than months and a purchase order, which gives the axis its real definition. A choke point is not what you produce a lot of, it is what somebody else cannot start producing quickly, and both halves of that sentence are doing work. Notice that this axis has almost nothing to do with size. A small economy holding a genuine choke point has bargaining power that a very large economy producing ordinary goods does not. And notice what this axis cannot tell you. Holding a choke point says nothing about whether the country is getting richer, whether its people have work, or whether anything else in the economy functions. It is one axis, which is precisely the point. Question 2. When goods cross this country's border, who owns the value inside them? This is the axis with the largest gap between how a country looks and how it is doing, and we are going to see it fail in both directions before this section ends. Fail in both directions before this section ends. File 2 put a number on this that has stayed with the season. Vietnam exported an enormous volume of manufactured goods, and a large majority of that export value was shipped by foreign-owned firms rather than domestic ones. Read what that separates: having the factories and owning what the factories produce. Those are different economic positions, and they generate completely different futures. A country that assembles receives wages. A country that owns receives wages, margin, technology, supplier relationships, and the decision about where the next plant goes. And File 3 showed the same axis from the other end, which is where it gets uncomfortable for rich countries. Because losing ownership and losing factories turn out to be different events, and one of them happened without anyone noticing. 6.7 million manufacturing jobs disappeared in the United States. Output did not disappear with them. The factories kept producing with fewer people, and the reshoring wave that followed brought back plants that were built by policy and run by machines. So the ownership axis has a nasty property. You can win it and still lose the jobs, because ownership and employment are also separate things. Every country in this season that assumed those moved together was wrong about its own economy. File 7 added the newest version. An economy can be growing on services, at income levels where history says it should be growing on factories, with a domestic financial system it genuinely owns. That is a high score on ownership and no score at all on the industrial base. Nobody knows yet what that combination produces because it has not finished happening. Question 3, and this is the one the season spent the most time on. Was this capability built or was it lent? Stay with this one because it has a hidden dependency that took us until File 7 to find, and it is the reason a country can do everything right and still lose. File 5 was the cleanest case of building. A state selected export sectors. Banks fed them capital on condition of export performance. Families paid for the education that staffed them. 3 parts, deliberately assembled, and it worked well enough to move a country from poorer than Ghana to a high-income economy inside one lifetime. And the same file found the bill. The 3 parts that made the machine work became the 3 constraints holding the country down afterwards. That is not a footnote about Korea. It is a property of built capability, real, durable, and carrying a cost that arrives later. Now the contrast from File 7. 2 economies growing at almost the same rate. One growing on mining, where the price is set on exchanges by people who have never visited. One building industrial parks and training a workforce. Same growth rate. One is being paid, the other is building. The growth figure cannot tell them apart, and that single fact is the strongest argument this season has produced for why the reported number is not the interesting one. But File 7 also found the sharp edge of this axis, and it is the reason the 4th question exists. Because a country can build the capability, execute the strategy correctly, and still lose, for a reason that has nothing to do with capability at all. Ethiopia built the parks and trained the workers. Then eligibility under a foreign trade statute ended, the buyers left, and thousands of jobs went with them. Nothing inside the country had failed, which means capability has a hidden dependency. You can own the factory and not own the door it sells through, and the door is somebody else's to close. Question 4. Are this country's promises believed? This is the axis almost nobody puts on a map of economic power, and it is the one that explains the case that makes least sense on every other axis. File 6. A country that began the 20th century among the 10 richest on Earth. World-class farmland, educated population, cities that were the envy of the hemisphere. On the resource axis, on the human capital axis, on almost any measure available in 1913, it scored superbly. And it spent the following century becoming relatively poorer under governments of every political description. The explanation the file arrived at was not a resource problem and not one wrong ideology. Wealth was the inheritance. What the country spent was the belief that its promises would hold. And once that is gone, everything costs more. Borrowing costs more. Investment arrives with shorter horizons or does not arrive. Citizens hold their savings in someone else's currency. The country pays a permanent surcharge on its own future, and no amount of farmland fixes it. That is why credibility is an axis rather than a footnote. It is not a moral quality. It is a price, and it shows up in every transaction the country makes. Now put files 5 and 6 side by side, because together they say something neither says alone. Korea's machine contains something Argentina never installed, a mechanism that could say no. Firms that missed their export numbers lost access to capital. The state could take support back. Argentina had no equivalent, and not because nobody thought of one. Every attempt to install one arrived during a crisis, and a crisis is exactly when a country can least afford to let things fail. So credibility is not built by promising. It is built by demonstrating repeatedly that the promise binds you even when keeping it hurts. There is no shortcut on this axis, which is why it is the slowest one to gain and the fastest one to lose. 4 axes then: chokepoint, ownership, capability, credibility. Before we assemble them, one thing about how they were arrived at. These were not designed in advance and then illustrated with examples. They are what was left after 7 files kept producing the same disagreements between what a number said and what was actually happening. Which matters because a framework built backwards from cases has one advantage over a framework built from theory. Every axis on it earned its place by explaining something that had already confused us. And the point of separating them is that they combine in ways a ranking cannot show. A country can hold a world-critical choke point and score poorly on ownership because the value is captured by firms headquartered elsewhere. That is not a contradiction. It is a position, and it is a common one. A country can build genuine capability and score badly on credibility, in which case it pays more than its neighbours to borrow against exactly the same assets. A country can score well on all 4 and still be small enough that it never appears in a conversation about global power. Power and prosperity are not the same variable, and the map does not pretend they are, which is the actual finding of this season, and it took 8 files to earn. There is no single ladder that countries climb. There are 4, they are climbed separately, and a country can be near the top of one while sitting at the bottom of another for decades. So, the useful question was never who is winning. It was this: on which axis, at whose expense, and for how long is that position defensible? And you can run that yourself now on any country from public data without waiting for anybody to publish a ranking. So, let us do one this season never touched to show the tool working on something cold. Take a mid-sized economy that exports a great deal of energy. Run the 4. Choke point. Energy is close to the opposite of a choke point because it is fungible. A buyer who loses one supplier buys from another at a slightly worse price. Painful, not decisive. Score it low, and it stays low no matter how large the reserves are. Ownership. This one depends entirely on a detail that never makes the headlines. Does the country own the extraction, the processing, and the shipping, or does it collect a royalty while foreign firms own the chain? Same barrels, completely different economy. Capability. Ask what the country would still be able to do if the resource ran out tomorrow. If the honest answer is nothing in particular, the score is 0, regardless of how strong the last decade of growth looked. And credibility. Does it save the windfall in a way that survives a change of government, or spend it in the year it arrives? That single question separates 2 well-known energy exporters more sharply than any other statistic about them. 4 questions, 5 minutes, no ranking required. And notice that the answer that came out is not a score. It is a list of what to watch, which is the only kind of forecast that stays useful once the facts move. Which brings us to the part most forecasts leave out, and the reason this episode is not a prediction. We are going to spend the next 2 minutes attacking everything just built, which is not modesty. It is the only way to find out whether a framework is worth keeping. There are 4 ways this map could be wrong, and they are worth stating precisely, because a framework that cannot be falsified is not a framework. It is a mood. First, technology can change the rules mid-game. File 4 found exactly that. Automation devalued cheap labor as a decisive advantage before India could finish using it. The same thing can happen again, to any axis here, from a direction nobody is currently modeling. Second, chokepoints move. The whole first file rests on a capability being genuinely hard to replicate. Enough capital and enough political will, sustained for long enough, can replicate most things. If that happens, Axis 1 weakens, and it will weaken quietly, rather than announcing itself. Third, politics overrides economics without warning. One statute in one legislature closed a market to a country that had done everything right industrially. No economic framework predicts that, including this one. Fourth, and most uncomfortable, the map is drawn with 3 different kinds of number. Historical income estimates are reconstructions with wide error bars. Growth figures for the current year are forecasts that get revised twice a year. Population figures for 2050 are models. They are not the same kind of fact, and any map that treats them identically is more confident than its inputs allow. None of that makes the framework useless. It makes it a tool with stated limits, which is the only honest kind. 8 files. 1 island holding a choke point. A country with the factories and not the ownership. A rich world that lost the jobs and kept the output. 1 billion people industrializing into an age of machines. A machine that worked and sent the bill to the kitchen table. An inheritance spent on lost credibility. And a continent that has to be read one country at a time. Every one of them was one of 4 questions, wearing different clothes. And if there is a single sentence this season earned, it is this: power does not move to whoever produces the most. It moves to whoever holds the part that cannot be replaced, keeps the value they create, builds what they cannot be lent, and is believed when they make a promise. Most countries manage 2 of those. Almost nobody manages 4. Next season, we go back to Axis 1, and to the single question this season kept deferring. What actually happens to a choke point when the rest of the world decides, all at once and regardless of cost, that it can no longer afford to depend on it? This is the Rise Index. Subscribe and follow where power moves next.